So hello, I am honored to be here today to talk about political ideologies and the modern conservative movement. My talk today is an expansion upon a couple of pieces that I wrote for the Washington Post, combined with research from my forthcoming manuscript. When I was writing my dissertation on far-right conservatism, my advisor hammered me about definitions constantly. She would say, you must define your terms. What is conservatism? What is ultraconservatism? What do these things mean? Sometimes I wanted to fall back on Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart's indelible phrase, "I know it when I see it." Obviously, that wasn't going to work. And so over the course of my studies and in the ensuing years, I developed a working taxonomy of right-wing ideologies and their interactions. So for the first few minutes of this talk, I'm going to lay out my broad conceptualization of modern conservatism. Then I'm going to analyze the kind of complicated relationship between conservatism and federal power and state power. And then we're going to conclude by deconstructing the malleable phrase modern conservatism and how it's morphed over time, ending with the idea of entitlement conservatism. Political scientist Clinton Rossiter once called conservatism one of the most confusing words in the glossary of political thought and oratory. Indeed, conservatism defining it is difficult. Movements and ideologies can be discordant and contradictory. Plus, the political spectrum can shift over time. What was once unthinkable may one day be the new normal. In general, American conservatism embodies a distrust of reform, a suspicion of centralized power, and a desire to maintain the socio-political status quo. Historian George Nash wrote that these tendencies manifested during the Cold War as libertarian fears of federal encroachment and adherence to traditional social norms, and what he called a devotion to evangelical anti-communism. Of course, this interpretation is still being debated and refined. Political scientist George Hawley recently expanded those definitional parameters, arguing that conservatism encompasses any ideology in which equality is not the central pursuit. These contentions, when viewed as a coherent whole, form a big tent conceptualization of conservatism. Conservatism is not monolithic, but instead an ideological map of intersecting ideas. The political spectrum resembles a gradient rather than a series of incontrovertible definitions. Accordingly, conservatism was and remains a continuum marked by complex, overlapping relationships between centrists, pragmatists, libertarians, nationalists, religious fundamentalists, far-right conservatives, and even fringe extremists. Because of this complex philosophical web, I avoid crafting rigid definitions. A scholar can get really deep in the weeds trying to draw firm divisions, separating the far right from the mainstream. It's like genres of rock and roll almost. There's classic rock, there's alternative rock, you've got punk rock and hard rock, even post-rock. But in the end, they're all different riffs building upon the same central concept of rock music. Similarly, I view the ambiguous relationship between conservative factions as constantly shifting and evolving. This allows us to examine Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, Donald Trump as part of the same philosophical lineage. So, one of the guiding principles of modern conservatism is a distrust bordering on hatred of the liberal state. Every faction under the conservative umbrella viewed the state, and again, notably the liberal state, as anathema. Yet anti-statism was and remains a malleable philosophy. It explained and animated conservatives' distrust of federal authority, their antipathy toward taxation, a sympathy for states' rights, and a disdain for reform movements. There were multiple intellectual origins for this ubiquitous anti-statist anxiety, particularly within the libertarian tradition. During the height of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in 1935, Albert J. Nock, who was a right-wing intellectual and author, described the state, meaning the federal government, as blundering and wasteful, vicious. A federal government, he said, was dominated by a nebulous cabal of collectivists. The title of Nock's book was titled "Our Enemy the State," and it served as an ideological mission statement for the libertarian movement. Later conservative thinkers followed upon Knox's thesis. Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek argued that an enlarged governmental bureaucracy put society on an inexorable road to serfdom. Hayek and other right-wing authors stretched the term bureaucracy to mean anything from New Deal liberalism to Nazi fascism. Writer-philosopher Ayn Rand took Knox's thesis a step further, viewing the state as a consummate destroyer. Business owners portrayed liberal economic regulations as dangerous federal tyranny, prompting the rise of free enterprise rhetoric and the formation of the business conservative movement. The South, of course, had a well-worn tradition of anti-statism, but at times, Southern conservatism differed from the libertarian right. Southerners distrusted the power of capital and industrial modernism, and often rooted their anti-statism in the rhetoric of social and religious tradition. States' rights, segregation, white supremacy, Confederate apologia, these were the building blocks of conservative Southern identity. Donald Davidson, who was a member of the Southern agrarian movement, described the federal government as a leviathan and wrote that black heels on white necks was the sine qua non of Reconstruction. This same rhetoric would later be used to demonize civil rights legislation. The state, in other words, menaced Southern culture. After World War II, William Buckley, Frank Meyer, and a host of other conservative thinkers developed a fusion of right-wing ideals. Historian Paul Murphy noted that this modern conservatism brought together Southern states' rightists, Midwestern isolationists, free market economists, Catholic traditionalists, and even anti-communist Cold Warriors. This coalition of conservatives cast liberalism, which was the post-war era's dominant political philosophy, as the enemy. Buckley founded National Review, the periodical, as a loudspeaker for the conservative movement. He wrote that the periodical's mission statement, and he wrote the mission statement, and number one on the list read this way, quote, "It is the job of centralized government in peacetime to protect its citizens' lives and property. All other activities of government tend to diminish freedom and hamper progress. The growth of government, the dominant social feature of this century, must be fought relentlessly." These anti-statist arguments still have incredible purchase within modern conservatism. Ronald Reagan famously said that the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Notably, in 2013, Donald Trump tweeted out that exact phrase. Anti-statism in some ways formed the connective tissue of the conservative movement by bridging ideological and regional differences and forging kind of a unified ideology. At its core, conservatism espouses a small government philosophy. That government is best that governs least, as Henry David Thoreau put it. Yet, time and again, conservative presidents and members of Congress have greatly expanded and at times abused state authority. In reality, conservatives have a paradoxical and some might say hypocritical relationship with state power. This ideological inconsistency is not a recent aberration, however. It was woven into the very fabric of modern conservatism. Even before the modern conservative movement took shape, right-wing politicians in both parties wielded state power against liberal opponents. Congressman Martin Dies Jr., for example, a far-right Texas Democrat, formed the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, during the Great Depression. HUAC's original target was domestic fascist movements, but the committee soon expanded its mandate to investigate New Deal programs and labor unions for traces of communism. The fact that some communists in fact existed convinced Dies and his ilk that liberalism was, or enabled, un-American subversion. The Dies Committee bequeathed a statist blueprint for intimidating political adversaries. After World War II, anti-communist hysteria created the perfect environment for widening this strategy. Liberals were derided by conservatives as soft on communism, so they signed off on anti-communist policies. And HUAC continued hunting and occasionally finding communist witches. But it was Senator Joseph McCarthy, a Wisconsin Republican, who proved the most eager to exploit Dies' strategy. McCarthy depicted liberalism as a gateway for communist subversion. From his Senate post, he led investigations into Truman and Eisenhower's administration. McCarthy even claimed that a grand communist cabal had infiltrated the army. So outrageous were McCarthy's conspiracies and methods that his fellow senators censured him. But conservatives stood by McCarthy. For example, Senator Barry Goldwater, a central figure of the conservative movement, voted against the censure measure. Buckley co-wrote a book defending McCarthy. The takeaway from McCarthy's investigations was that conservatives had no problem using state power so long as the target was left-wing enemies. The exploits of Richard Nixon, a former HUAC investigator himself, led historian Arthur Schlesinger to fret about the imperial presidency. Nixon was both the darling of the law and order crowd and the president who most violated the rule of law. Nixon used state power to cover up the Watergate scandal. White House counsel John Dean revealed that Nixon kept an enemies list, a list of politicians and private citizens who Nixon planned to screw, that was his words, by ordering the IRS to audit them. At the time of his resignation, Nixon embodied the imperial presidency, a tyrant manipulating state power for political gain. Even the more ideologically conservative Ronald Reagan embodied this contradiction. Reagan governed as a conservative. He cut taxes, he deregulated multiple industries, fought unions, retrenched welfare programs. Yet Reagan also favored an expansive use of state power. As California governor, he unleashed police forces, particularly the FBI, upon Berkeley anti-war protesters and the Black Panthers. During his presidency, Reagan poured money into the military-industrial complex and proposed budget-busting programs such as the Strategic Defense Initiative. Deficits soared, even as conservatives championed fiscal responsibility. Reagan also made common cause with social conservatives, who desired to use state power to impose their will on moral issues, ranging from abortion to gay rights. Roughly a decade later, George W. Bush's administration pushed state expansion into overdrive. Bush slashed taxes and constricted the welfare state while boosting defense budgets. And the surveillance state flourished under Bush as well. After 9/11, Bush signed the Patriot Act, giving federal authorities vast search and seizure powers to ostensibly fight terrorism. Years later, Bush endorsed an amended version of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, otherwise known as FISA, through which the NSA established a massive digital dragnet sweeping up information from American citizens. Yet, while conservative Republicans nurtured federal power, the husk of anti-statism remained. During Barack Obama's presidency, right-wingers sounded the alarm about the imperial presidency. Conservatives objected to Obama's numerous executive orders, calling the president a king, a dictator, and an emperor. Senator Ted Cruz characterized Obama as a lawless president. At the 2012 Republican National Convention, Congressman Paul Ryan declared, "The choice is whether to put hard limits on economic growth or hard limits on the size of government, and we choose to limit government." Note that Republicans like Ryan supported Bush's Patriot Act and the FISA Act, but returned to small government arguments when a Democrat inhabited the White House. Conservatives, which today are found almost entirely in the Republican Party, have developed an effective ideological two-step. When Democrats controlled the government, right-wingers foreground their libertarianism and issue dire warnings about state tyranny. Then, after the political pendulum swings back their direction, they brandish and expand state power when it suits their interests or benefits their coalition. The reality is that for conservatives, anti-statism is often political strategy masquerading as a commitment to ideological purity. And so, at this juncture, meaning modern juncture in American history, conservatism is permutating, fracturing its anti-statist foundation in favor of the siren song of authoritarianism. But again, this should not come as a surprise. This anti-statist paradox has been baked into modern conservatism. This ideological paradox has come into sharp relief during the presidency of Donald Trump. Back in 2014, Senator Lindsey Graham fumed that Obama's unprecedented executive order on immigration, and this is his quote, "tramples on the concept of constitutional checks and balances." Now, with Trump at the helm, Republicans support an iron-fisted executive branch. No Republicans voiced objections when Trump issued 55 executive orders during his first year in office, more than Obama signed in any one year. When Trump floated the idea of declaring a national emergency to fulfill his promised border wall, Republicans fell in line. Graham, who has emerged as one of Trump's most zealous defenders, even sent encouraging tweets. Mr. President, declare a national emergency now. Build a wall now, and now is in all caps. Trump declared an emergency in February, citing an invasion of, and this is his words, an invasion of drugs and criminals coming into our country. While announcing the emergency, however, his real reasoning became quite clear. This is again a quote from Trump. I could do the wall over a longer period of time. I didn't need to do this, but I'd rather do it much faster. In other words, Trump declared a national emergency and thus used presidential and state power to get around the partisan gridlock in Washington. Despite claiming to be in favor of small government, conservative Republicans embrace a philosophy that I call entitlement conservatism. At its core, this philosophy employs state power to protect conservative entitlements at the expense of everyone else. Bound up in this idea of entitlement conservatism are questions of legitimacy. Who qualifies as a legitimate citizen? Who has the legitimate right to benefit from government power? Who has the legitimate right to run the United States? These are questions with deep historical roots that continue to reverberate throughout our current era. Let's deal first with the question of legitimate citizenship. Citizenship has been contested ground since the dawn of the nation. In 1798, a Federalist Congress passed and John Adams signed the Immigration Act, which tightened immigration protocols in an effort to hurt their political opposition, the Democratic Republicans. Years later, nativist groups like the Immigration Restriction League sought to stem the flow of immigrants into America, fearing that so-called undesirables could never assimilate. Southern states suppressed the rights of black citizens long after the 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship and equal protection under the law. In our modern era, citizenship remains a contested notion. Trump frequently attacks people of color, foreign-born Americans, and immigrant populations. He casts non-supporters of all stripes as an illegitimate out-group. Their Americanness is up for question. He doesn't speak for them, nor are they part of his Volk, his people. Citizenship, then, can only be defined in reactionary terms by those seeking a return to an earlier, often whiter, status quo. On the day Trump rode down a golden escalator to announce his presidential campaign, I'm sure you're all very familiar with this, he made a pointed and much debated comment about Mexican immigrants. Quote, "When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people." It was almost as if the idea of some immigrants being good people was an afterthought. When Gonzalo Curiel, an Indiana-born judge of Mexican descent, temporarily stopped the construction of Trump's border wall, Trump called Curiel a hater and accused him of bias because of his Mexican heritage. Trump also spent months claiming that he would have won the popular vote were it not for millions of illegal votes. These allegations were not only untrue, they revealed Trump's conceptualization of citizenship. Only his supporters counted. Trump tried to use state power to secure the privilege of his constituency. His administration attempted to place a citizenship question on the 2020 census with the intent of depressing the participation of foreign-born people and their families. If implemented, studies showed that this census would misrepresent the nation's demographics. It would also increasingly tilt congressional power in favor of rural Republican voters, which was the goal of the strategy from the start. In July of this year, Trump scorned progressive congresswomen who dared to speak against him. This is a direct quote from Trump. He said, "Why don't they go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came?" That was July 14th. 3 days later, July 17th, Trump smirked as one of his rally crowds chanted, "Send her back." The object of scorn was Ilhan Omar, the congresswoman from Minnesota, an outspoken Trump critic. Omar is notably a Somali-born naturalized citizen. The phrase "send her back" represented a vulgar attempt to erase Omar's legitimacy as a critic, as an elected politician, and as a citizen. As the New York Times editorial board wrote, Trump seeks to demonize those who oppose his policies as dangerous extremists out to destroy America. So according to the tenets of entitlement conservatism, only white people, especially those who support Donald Trump, are unequivocally entitled to claim the rights of citizenship. Everyone else's legitimacy is up for debate. So let's address the second concern of entitlement conservatism, the idea of who benefits from government welfare. Scholars have long been aware of a phenomenon known as welfare chauvinism, the idea that government benefits ought to be reserved for the more deserving members of one's own race or like an in-group. Rather than shrinking the state equally, conservatives have often focused on removing benefits from particular populations while rewarding their own constituency. After Franklin Roosevelt's liberal revolution, conservatives mobilized to retrench the legacies of the welfare state. Yet a full-scale rollback of the liberal state proved to be consistently unpopular, leaving conservatives marginalized in both parties in the 1950s and forcing the adoption of new tactics. The most effective approach was appealing to angry whites who were convinced that minorities were unfairly seizing the benefits and privileges that they felt they had earned. Senator Strom Thurmond, a Southern segregationist, defined the 1964 Civil Rights Act as, quote, discrimination against the white man, and another quote, the beginning of a dictatorship. Thurmond embodied the anger of Southern whites and portended a coming sea change in American politics when he switched to the Republican Party over Democrats' support of civil rights. In 1968, Alabama Democrat George Wallace ran a third-party campaign for the presidency, promising a return to law and order, as he put it, in the face of those civil rights agitators and their hippie beatnik commie allies. Wallace was not, however, a small government conservative, and conservatives pointed this out quite a bit. Even as he inveighed against the briefcase-toting bureaucrats in Washington, he supported generous welfare programs as governor of Alabama, so long as the recipients of state benefits were white people. He framed non-white people as parasites feeding off of the system. The strategy of channeling white resentment played a key role in the ascent of Ronald Reagan. During the 1976 GOP primary, Reagan inflamed the rage of white conservatives by infamously invoking the specter of welfare queens, a racist stereotype asserting that people of color were somehow, some way gaming the system. Many Wallace supporters transitioned into Reagan Republicans. Reagan's rhetoric on government and economic issues often sounded a lot more like pure small government conservatism than Wallace's philosophy. But in reality, after Reagan took power in 1981, conservatives governed more like Wallace than their rhetoric led on. Rather than slashing state power across the board, Reagan embraced elements of entitlement conservatism. True to strategist Lee Atwater's words, his administration used the rhetoric of austerity and anti-statism to gut anti-poverty welfare programs, actions that disproportionately affected minority families. Simultaneously, his supply-side economic program increased inheritance tax exemptions, lowered estate taxes, and instituted tremendous tax cuts across the board, all of which exacerbated the wealth gap, particularly within the black community. In the ensuing years, Republicans sold their agenda with rhetoric about economic growth or giving Americans choices, but the result increasingly skewed government benefits away from the neediest and often non-white Americans. Rather than getting government off the backs of Americans, conservatives have created selective government, the core of entitlement conservatism. What makes Trump's presidency different is that he has stripped the rhetorical varnish off of this conservative idea. To Trump's mind, the government should benefit either his constituency or his class. His proposed budget would cut funding for programs like Medicaid and SNAP that benefit poor Americans, especially those of color. At the same time, Trump signed a massive tax cut, primarily benefiting the wealthy, and is currently doling out agricultural subsidies that disproportionately aid affluent white farmers. One recent report noted that the top 1% of farmers would receive roughly $180,000 each, while the bottom 80% receive on average less than $5,000. Clearly, poor whites might also suffer from Trump's trade wars or welfare cuts or the efforts to gut Obamacare, but Trump mollifies them with a steady stream of vitriolic white grievance, keeping them, at least rhetorically, from the bottom rung of the country's hierarchy. In practice, Trump is creating a racially exclusionary welfare state, with benefits flowing primarily to wealthy corporate interests and secondarily to white Americans in rural areas, a vision not far removed from that of conservative Southern Democrats in the 1930s. While libertarian conservatism allows inequality to congeal through a lack of regulatory action, the conservatism that Trump represents does the exact opposite. At a recent conference they called themselves National Conservatives, there were calls for the aggressive use of federal power to benefit what author J.D. Vance called our people. Entitlement conservatism benefits only those within the in-group, entrenching and exacerbating economic and racial hierarchies. Accordingly, only conservatives are entitled to reap the benefits of state power. Now, the last category involves power itself. Conservatives don't simply worry about who benefits from government. They worry about who controls government as well. One strategy followed by generations of right-wing activists has been to demonize the opposition, positioning liberalism as an illegitimate idea. During the 1930s, for example, conservatives fretted that the New Deal might diminish or even worse, redistribute the power afforded by wealth. Rather than acquiesce to this new political normal, right-wingers maligned the New Deal as a communist plot. The Liberty League, which was a group of wealthy industrialists, characterized the New Deal as a vicious combination of fascism, socialism, and communism, all at once. In 1936, with Roosevelt up for re-election, Al Smith, who was a fellow New York Democrat, friend of Roosevelt's, maligned Roosevelt's vision of positive governance. I'm going to quote Al Smith's speech here, and it's a long quote, but bear with me. So he said, "There can only be one capital, Washington or Moscow. There can only be one atmosphere of government, the clean, pure, fresh air of free America or the foul breath of communistic Russia. There can only be one flag, the Stars and Stripes, or the red flag of the godless Union of the Soviet. There can be only one national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, or the International." Others worried about the effect of liberal governance on race relations. J. Evetts Haley, who is a Texas cattleman and far-right activist, said this: "The breakdown of color lines and the mixture of the races, black, white, and tan, is one of the cardinal principles of the red philosophy. Already the initial steps have been carefully taken by the leading lights of the New Deal." Red baiting, of course, did not go away after Roosevelt died in 1945. In fact, the ensuing Cold War created a national zeitgeist of anti-communism. We already talked about Senator Joseph McCarthy's conspiratorial investigations. William Buckley also said that international socialism had captured both parties. This sort of language, though, went beyond just normal Washington politicking. These criticisms portrayed liberals as illegitimate, un-American usurpers. After the Cold War, conservatives fused lingering anti-communist sentiments to form new types of conservative aggrievement. Newt Gingrich's scorched earth politicking in the 1990s and the Tea Party movement of 2008-2010 created a political environment that fostered a renaissance of xenophobic nativism and small government rhetoric. Propaganda filtered throughout conservative websites portraying Obama as either a dupe or a fellow traveler of communists. Right-wing author Aaron Klein, who writes for Breitbart and a number of other websites, wrote that the, quote, radicals in Obama's administration sought to weaken or destroy America's capitalist free enterprise system. Other critiques bore the taint of xenophobic racism. Far-right critics, including then television star Donald Trump, accused Barack Obama of being a Kenyan-born Muslim. Then, as we all know, in 2015, Trump decided to run for president. He campaigned as a right-wing populist, someone from outside of Washington who could speak for the little people, which is ironic considering his claim to fame as a billionaire playboy. He proclaimed that he would make sure government benefits went to the right kind of people. His base skewed whiter, less educated, more affluent. Despite his Wallace-esque promises to working-class whites, however, Trump's policies overwhelmingly serve wealthy whites. Corporate executives line his cabinet, embodying the belief that wealthy conservatives are entitled to rule the United States and positioning them to enact scores of policies, advancing the cause of the biggest, most powerful corporations at the expense of average citizens. In Trump's eyes, their wealth qualifies them to rule. To many of his supporters, their whiteness does. Trump diehards believe that they represent the legitimate will of the country, But Trump's brand of conservatism has experienced some recent setbacks. A blue wave hit America in 2018, ushering a Democratic majority into the House. Just this week, Democrats flipped the governorship of Kentucky, a state that went for Trump heavily in 2016, and took a commanding hold of Virginia. However, David Frum, who is a never-Trumper conservative writer, offered a stark warning in light of these Democratic victories. Frum said, "If conservatives become convinced that they cannot win democratically, they will not abandon conservatism. They will reject democracy." Instead of prompting soul-searching or a quest for ideological moderation, these electoral setbacks have sparked conspiracy theories and efforts to further delegitimize the opposition. Rather than attributing the loss in Virginia to Trump's divisiveness, Fox News' Laura Ingraham claimed that, and these are her words, demographic changes and a large foreign-born population made Virginia a, quote, petri dish for radical left-wing ideas. Dr. Kelly Ward, who is an Arizona Republican chairwoman, took away a similar lesson from this week's elections. Noting that broad swaths of rural Virginians voted for Republican Matt Bevin, but Matt Bevin lost, she wondered, should we look toward an electoral college-type system at the state level? The implication being that conservative minority should overrule the majority. After all, that minority represents the true America, beset by an illegitimate majority. This attempt to cement Republicans in power might seem like just pure partisanship, but it's reflective of a belief that conservatives alone are entitled to the reins and benefits of governance. With Trump under threat of impeachment, those cries will only grow louder. Trump has called the Democrats' impeachment inquiry a hoax and a coup. His campaign manager defined it as a, and this is a direct quote, seditious conspiracy to overthrow the people's president. Conservative writer Molly Hemingway wrote a fit of hysteria in The Federalist this week, describing impeachment as an attempt to tear down the foundations of our republic by corrupt, unelected bureaucrats. If it succeeds, she warned, America would cease to be a constitutional, democratic republic. The fact of the matter is that impeachment is part of the Constitution's system of checks and balances. Nevertheless, as scholar George Thomas noted this week as well, it's not just that the constitutional institutions and norms do not bother or do not matter to Trump. It's that he sees them as illegitimate when they constrain his power. Indeed, Trump has cast himself as America's true voice, the only person who can solve America's problems. He literally said that on the campaign trail. In this authoritarian vision, Trump is the only legitimate state. Now, I wrote about entitlement conservatism back in August, but a couple of days ago, Adam Serwer, who's a writer for The Atlantic, published a piece which inadvertently, I think, provided a really good encapsulation of my argument. Serwer wrote, "The core of Trumpist nationalism is the claim that the minority of voters who support the president are the only ones empowered to shape the direction of the country and the only ones who can confer legitimacy on the U.S. government." And so after years of demonizing the Democrats as the party of big government and entitlement spending, the Republicans now embrace the idea of entitlement conservatism. The irony is that state power, which was once viewed as the conservative bête noire, has become the skeleton key to unlocking right-wing political victories. Thank you.
So, when you were discussing the voting demographics, for example, those that supported Trump back in 2016, and I hear this a lot. I hear this quite often from people who they say when they mention that a large number of those voters were uneducated, it comes off as if it's an insult to, like, it's to delegitimize his voter base for the fact that they were working class and educated Americans. I was just going to say, I feel like that, I'm just wondering if you intended that statement as to delegitimize his voter base, or am I just projecting from what I've seen in the media?
No, not at all. I mean, my study of it is just more looking at the numbers, because by and large, the area of the country that Trump absolutely dominates in terms of numbers is white men with lower than a college education. Like, that's just the numbers. Those are just the facts. However, I understand what you're saying about using that as kind of a cudgel, like a way of saying, like, oh, these are just ignorant Americans, like, voting for Trump. Like, but that's not what I'm saying. I don't think that's true. I think that, there's a reason why it should, like, one person, one vote, right? Like, the people who live out in the rural countryside matter just as much as the people who live in the cities.
Yeah, and they have the right to participate in the system, because even if maybe they're not that educated about issues and facts and the like, but they can still fight for social conditions that they might want in their communities, which some of those are good, some of those are neutral, some of those are bad.
Absolutely. I mean, for example, I think that, if you want to talk like policy, a lot of the Democrats who are running for president right now are really quite short on rural policy. Like, how are they going to help farmers who are struggling? There's not much of a conversation happening about farmers getting pushed out because of mechanization or because of large corporate farms. Those are things that matter to rural communities. There's a reason why rural communities are decaying still, but that's just not the conversation happening in the Democratic primary.
Hey, anybody else? So, I have a question.
All right.
So you talk about the paradox of conservatives wanting to use state power to advance their ends, but talking about states' rights over federal rights. So we had an interesting case a couple of years ago in Texas and Austin with the city trying to regulate Uber.
Oh, I remember, yeah.
Any thoughts on how that fits into all of this? And the state stepped in and said, you can't do that. So that was another case of sort of the big government, but it's states.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting, there are even some conservatives who argue that, like, the state government is still too big. They think local government should, like, be able to overrule, state governments, right? And so I think that is an interesting conversation. I also think an interesting conversation that happens around the idea of states' rights is how, progressives might not realize it, but they essentially make the same argument when they're arguing for legalization of marijuana in Colorado. Right? Colorado's still, or marijuana is still illegal according to federal standards. Trump could send in people, just arrest every single dispensary there is. It would still be illegal, but, it would be unpopular. But that technically is kind of like a states' rights argument, if you think, like, in a certain way.
Okay.
So it seems right that conservatives love big government just as much as liberals do. They just use it for different ends, right? How does that inform how you understand conservatism more generally? I mean, I know you said you don't like definitions to a certain extent, but I'm curious how that makes you see what it boils down to.
Well, I think one of the key differences between, and that's a great question, one of the key differences, I think, between, liberals and conservatives is that progressives are upfront about using governance, right? I mean, look at Liz Warren. I mean, every time someone asks her a question, she's like, I've got a policy for that. Essentially saying, like, I plan on using government power to fix this thing. Whereas Republicans tend to hide more behind this idea of, well, we're the party of small government, and so they that's why I call it like a two-step, right? That they, on this one hand, they'll say, well, we're not in favor of expanding the government, and on the other hand, they do, though, in their own particular ways. And so I would just say, the way that I would look at it is that liberals, progressives, Democrats are open about wanting to use government power, and I would just say that conservatives do anyway, they just aren't as open about it.
There are a couple of terms you mentioned along the way. One is hierarchy and one is equality. Essentially, is that what separates right and left? That the right supports all kinds of hierarchies. Some of it is economic, some of it is racial in nature. Is that maybe the dividing line that best explains this?
It could, I mean, that's, I think, a fair way to look at it. I mentioned George Hawley's book, and I thought his argument that conservatism encapsulated anything that basically wouldn't lead to equality, I thought that was a really fascinating argument. I'm not sure I agree with it, but I think it's fascinating because, yeah, the idea is that conservatives in general are okay with hierarchies, depending on what kind they're talking about. There's always some sort of group that has to be like an out group. But you could argue kind of like similarly that progressives view that the same way. It might be wealthy people, right? But they have different arguments for why those people need to be taxed more, for example. But I think that's accurate, right? That I would say conservatives in general are more comfortable with there being some sort of hierarchy in society, perhaps.
Okay, we have one more, and then you guys can go get some pizza.
Hi, thanks for your talk. You mentioned earlier in the talk that you see Trump as part of the same philosophical tradition as Reagan and Bush. And I just wonder, is he, or is this more of an aberration? And as a follow-up to that, what happens post-Trump to the conservative movement and the party, whether he's out in another year or he wins a second term?
The second question's tough. I mean, I have no idea, especially because, I mean, in 2016, right, people were lining up. I mean, Lindsey Graham tweeted out, if we elect Donald Trump, we will get destroyed and we will deserve it. That's what Lindsey Graham tweeted in the election, and now he's like one of Trump's most vehement supporters. So I can never predict, what the conservative movement is going to look like. But regarding the idea of like a philosophical lineage, like, yeah, absolutely. I think there are a couple of different ways where Trump deviates from people like Reagan and Bush, particularly on tax or on trade policy, right? Trump is much more of like a protectionist. He's much more in favor of using tariffs as kind of like a weapon in trade. Reagan and Bush, of course, were very famous for their like free trade type of things. But in a lot of other ways, I view them as very similar. I mean, Reagan, I don't know if y'all saw the interview that came, or like there was a leaked audio of Reagan basically disparaging, using really racist language about African leaders. It came out just a couple months ago, which to a lot of people who've studied Reagan was very careful not to be overtly racist in public, but he did start his presidential campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, right? There's a reason for that, right? That's where the 1964 Freedom Summer murders happened. And I think that Trump is in that realm of particularly using racial anxiety, which I think is a very conservative worldview. The idea of trying to hearken back to some time in America's past where things were better, and again, that depends on who you are. Everybody has, you always hear about like the good old days. And I think that in that lineage, Trump is very much part of it. Also, Trump has talked a big game about being not a war hawk or not expanding the military state, and I mean that's just not true. He pulled troops out of Syria certainly, but he just sent them to Saudi Arabia instead. So he is not really reducing wars the way he said he would in the election. So.
All right, thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you.
Be sure to follow us on social media at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Like this video, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button to be notified about our latest content.